When it comes to Drake, what just dropped is one of the most self-revealing things any major artist has publicly released in recent memory. If you want to understand exactly where Drake's head is right now, what this album is actually going to be, and why the Iceman era just crossed into entirely new territory, leave a like, subscribe, and pay close attention. Because what he just put out into the world is not what he thinks it is.
Leave a like and subscribe because the community staying honest and informed matters more than ever right now. Because Drake has been actively trying to manufacture a counter-narrative through his fan base, and the only real answer to that is keeping this conversation grounded in what is actually happening. And what is actually happening right now is worth examining very carefully.
This is a turning point, not in the way Drake's camp wants it to be, not as a momentum shift or a cultural reset, but as a moment where the full picture of what the Iceman era actually is has become impossible to misread. The noise is about to get louder, the chaos is about to get messier, and the space between what Drake is presenting and what is actually going on underneath it has never been wider. Because beneath all the staging and the theatrical rollout elements, the cinematic episodes, the smoke productions, the ice sculptures, what is actually happening with Drake's career infrastructure right now is more serious than any of those distractions suggest. His relationship with UMG, his commercial standing, his institutional leverage, all of it is at a lower point than it has ever been, and what he just released makes that reality impossible to ignore. Drake has published a 69-page document that he is calling a mood board and that functions in practice as a personal diary, a spite journal, a documented record of every grievance, every perceived betrayal, and every unresolved resentment he is carrying into this album rollout. This is not a creative vision statement. This is not album artwork in any conventional sense. This is a 40-year-old man with enormous resources choosing to process his feelings in public and calling it an album promo. And what makes this document so revealing is not just that it exists, it is what is inside it. Because scrolling through these pages, what you encounter is not a coherent artistic vision for the album. What you encounter is a catalog of grudges. Every person who disappointed Drake, every moment he felt disrespected, every figure he plans to address when Iceman eventually lands, all of it is here, assembled into something he has officially designated as the creative foundation of his comeback record.
The diary is going viral, but not for the reasons Drake intended. It is not generating excitement about the music. It is generating conversation because it is strange, petty, and revealing in ways that confirm what most people already suspected about where Drake actually is emotionally and professionally right now. The further into it you go, the more obvious that becomes.
Within the early pages, images of Drake at a dentist appointment, sitting alongside a pack of crayons. The disconnect between the presentation and the intent is already visible. This is not artistically bold. This is not subversive or conceptual in any meaningful way. It reads very specifically as confirmation of things that have already been said about Drake in very famous songs by very famous rappers. And those rappers are almost certainly watching all of this with a quiet sense of satisfaction. Moving deeper into the actual content, the first significant diss embedded in the diary involves a photo of Drake and DJ Khaled from their 2023 tour, with Khaled holding a sign announcing 2 Drake features on an upcoming album that never materialized. When Khaled later tried to restart that rollout in 2025, Drake publicly distanced himself from the features entirely. Petty, predictable, and consistent with every other pattern Drake has established in how he handles relationships that do not go the way he wants them to. But the Khaled detail is less about Khaled and more about what it confirms about how this diary was assembled. Drake has been cataloging perceived slights and documenting grievances systematically, not just against his main rivals, but against anyone who failed to deliver what he expected. This is not a mood board, it is an accounting ledger, and Iceman is going to be the invoice. The Pinocchio imagery recurring throughout the diary, showing up in the Rollout episodes and again here, is not incidental. It is a recurring visual declaration that everyone around Drake lied, that everyone who changed their position or failed to show up is being addressed on this record. The visual language is consistent with the emotional position, which is that Drake has been wronged by virtually everyone, and Iceman is the response to all of them simultaneously.
And then there is page 52, which is where the diary stops being merely embarrassing and becomes genuinely significant from a business and professional standpoint. On page 52, Drake included, as official Iceman branding material, a photograph from the 2025 Grammy Awards. Specifically, Dr. Dre and UMG CEO Lucian Grainge celebrating together as Kendrick Lamar's Not Like Us won both Record of the Year and Song of the Year. Drake placed a photograph of his own label head celebrating the song that was made about him into his own album artwork.
And the caption Drake added next to that photograph is, "Remember, you are dust." That is not a subliminal. That is not an ambiguous reference open to interpretation. That is a direct, public, and officially branded declaration of hostility toward the CEO of the most powerful music company in the world. The person who controls Drake's catalog, his distribution, his commercial infrastructure, and every mechanism through which his music reaches an audience. Drake called his boss Dust in an album Rollout document. From a pure business perspective, setting aside every cultural and personal dimension of this is one of the most professionally reckless decisions any major artist has made in recent memory. Lucian Grainge runs a company that Drake has depended on for the entirety of his career at the highest commercial level. The infrastructure UMG provided, playlist placement, promotional backing, distribution, is what separated Drake's music from competing with everyone else, rather than operating within the same commercial ecosystem as them. And Drake just publicly told the person behind that infrastructure that he plans to reduce them to nothing.
And the timing makes this even more consequential. UMG had already reportedly pulled back their full support for Drake before his last project. The relationship was already fractured going into this moment. And rather than attempting to stabilize what remained of the professional relationship, or at minimum avoid making things demonstrably worse, Drake doubled down. He put the CEO's face in the album artwork, he attached a thread, and he released it publicly.
What this means for Iceman's commercial prospects is something that academics himself has now been forced to acknowledge. UMG is not supporting this album the way they have supported Drake's previous projects, which means Drake is attempting to release the most heavily theatrical and most ambitious rollout of his career without the label infrastructure that has historically made his albums commercially viable, regardless of their actual quality. That is not a minor obstacle. That is a structural problem with no obvious solution.
And the comparison to Kanye West's label exit is something worth examining carefully, because Kanye did eventually succeed in forcing a separation from his label, but Kanye had a specific kind of leverage Drake does not have. Kanye's departure was driven by circumstances that created genuine institutional pressure on the label to resolve the situation. Drake is attempting something similar, using public antagonism to force UMG's hand, but from a position where UMG holds substantially more leverage than Kanye's label did, and where Drake's commercial standing has already been significantly weakened before the confrontation began.
Because UMG's simplest available response to everything Drake is doing is not to release him, it is to do nothing. To let him sit on their roster, release nothing, provide no promotional support, and wait. Drake cannot force a release. Drake cannot force promotion. And without UMG's active participation, the commercial ceiling for Iceman is dramatically lower than anything being projected by the people around him. The power dynamic here is not ambiguous, and Drake's diary makes clear that he either does not fully understand it or has chosen to ignore it.
And pursuing a diss album aimed at Kendrick Lamar while simultaneously trying to challenge UMG's power structure is not a dual strategy. It is two separate and contradictory fights being waged simultaneously from a position of weakened leverage on both fronts. The creative battle requires one approach. The business battle requires a completely different one. And attempting to address both through the same album, released through a label that is actively withholding support, is not a viable path to winning either of them.
The contractual reality of Drake's situation adds another layer that makes the "You Are Dust" declaration look even more exposed. If UMG's existing deal gives them meaningful control over Drake's output and release schedule, which label deals at this level typically do, then Drake publicly antagonizing the CEO is not leverage, It is someone locked in a room, setting the furniture on fire and describing it as a negotiating position. The bravado and the actual power relationship are not aligned, and that gap is going to become visible the moment Iceman's Rollout hits the practical limits of what Drake can accomplish without UMG's support.
What is actually happening between Drake and UMG behind the scenes, the conversations, the ultimatums, the specific conditions being placed on any potential release is genuinely unknown. But the public-facing evidence converges on one conclusion. UMG is no longer actively invested in Drake's success. They may still profit from his existing catalog, regardless of what happens with new music. But the institutional commitment that made Drake's previous albums commercially viable, even the ones that probably should not have been, appears to be gone. And that absence changes everything about what Iceman can realistically be.
And then there is academics projecting 450,000 to 560,000 first-week units for Iceman, framing it explicitly as needing to double GNX's numbers to constitute a real statement. That projection is being made for an album with no label backing, a fractured institutional relationship, a rollout being partially routed through informal social media channels, and a lead artist who just publicly called the label CEO dust. The gap between what those numbers would require and what Drake's current commercial infrastructure can actually deliver is enormous. And by setting that bar, academics has constructed a framework in which virtually any realistic outcome gets coded as a loss.
GNX accomplished what it accomplished: 320,000 first-week streams, 0 physical copies, 0 bundles, 12 tracks, 5 Grammys, a Super Bowl performance, and the biggest hip-hop tour in recent memory, from an artist at the absolute peak of their cultural authority with organic momentum that required no manufactured hype to sustain. Doubling those numbers is not a realistic benchmark for Iceman. It is a projection built to manufacture the appearance of ambition, rather than reflect a genuine assessment of what is commercially achievable. And the Grammy photograph at the center of page 52 says everything that needs to be said about what this album actually is. Kendrick Lamar is not just the primary target of Iceman, he is the entire emotional architecture of it. Every decision, every rollout element, every diss embedded in the diary connects back to that night and what it represented. And building a comeback record around the person who already beat you, on top of a destroyed label relationship, aimed at an audience that has largely moved on, is not a formula for redemption. Resentment is not a creative vision, and albums built from that place reveal more about the person who made them than about anyone they are directed at. And the structural reality of what Iceman is walking into does not change regardless of what the music sounds like. If it performs well, the label captures the commercial upside, and Drake's leverage evaporates. If it underperforms, the decline accelerates, and UMG retains all decision-making power over what comes next. There is no outcome in which Drake exits this album cycle in a stronger position than he entered it, and the diary he just published has ensured that everyone watching understands that, before the music has even been heard.
Kendrick Lamar dropped 12 songs, gave no warning, ran no promotional campaign, and spent a year as the defining voice in hip-hop. Drake has spent 2 years building ice fortresses, commissioning smoke clouds, releasing a diary, filing lawsuits, and publicly calling his CEO dust, and is still primarily discussed in terms of his failures. That is not a coincidence. That is a direct consequence of choices made. And the person whose photograph Drake attached the words "You are dust" to is the one holding every meaningful card in determining what actually happens to Iceman next.
So, with all of that said, what does the "You are dust" caption tell you about where this is heading? What do you think UMG's actual next move is going to be? And what does Iceman realistically look like on the other side of all of this? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like and subscribe if you made it this far. It genuinely helps, and I appreciate every one of you. And check out the suggested video to see how Kendrick Lamar may already be positioning to step directly on top of Iceman the moment it surfaces, and why that possibility should concern Drake significantly more than anything currently happening with his label.